So I think we could just get, oh, my audio's cutting out. Can you guys hear me? I'm so sorry about that.
It's good. It's just a little bit choppy.
Just a little choppy? Okay. Let me know if it gets any, I'll try to plug in, maybe I'll fix it up.
All good, all good.
Okay, great.
I wonder, can people hear, can we do maybe a quick sound check? Can you all hear me okay? Is my sound clear?
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, how about you, Zach?
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you okay.
How's the audio? Okay. If I
Okay.
need to put on my headphones so we can talk a little bit closer, let me know. But this could work for now.
And
okay, all right.
Can everybody hear now, or is it still a little choppy?
What I would recommend, I love this opening tech check. I think what might support is if when the people who aren't speaking, if we keep our mics muted, because I think that it's true that there might be like some sound, some mic stuff going on. So that might be helpful. So I'll mute and then let you finish introducing us, Hannah, and then introducing this wonderful talk, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. Okay. So in the context of psychedelic use, some individuals say that experience has the potential to amplify and enrich their religious or spiritual convictions. This gives us a wide range of relationships that we need. I'm so grateful to have and his brother, if you didn't notice, who looks super alike, Ismail, to have this conversation with me. Oh, is my audio still cutting out? I'm so sorry. I can try going off the Wi-Fi, see if that helps. You guys can hear me perfectly fine, right? Isak and Izzy? Choppy? Okay, I'm going to plug in my AirPods.
Yeah, I popped in my headphones too.
We're working on it. Thanks everybody for the patience. This is probably my first time ever on Instagram Live, so this is going great for me so far.
This is like my third, and it always is like this.
Yeah, it's good technical difficulty. Way better? Okay, amazing. Can you guys hear me now? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm just gonna hop right into the questions for the sake of time. We are going to save the last 15 minutes for Q&As. So throughout this whole entire conversation, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. And what we'll do is at the end, we'll address those questions. We're not really gonna answer it during the duration of the chat. So for the both of you, Isak and Izzy, what does it mean to identify as a Muslim to you?
I'll let Izzy start.
Okay, all right. Well, this is a big question. I may actually, before I answer it, I just want to take a moment to appreciate that we're getting to have this conversation. I want to take a moment to appreciate and acknowledge the many people here who are attending, who maybe they're just interested because of their own kind of curiosity. Maybe they themselves have personal or cultural or historical kind of experience with Islam or with Muslim kind of culture. Maybe some of you are practicing Muslims. And I just want to acknowledge the deep complexity of this conversation before we get into it. And just hold that for the audience, because, you know, we're here, and I'm really grateful, Hannah, for the invitation. I'm really grateful for Chacruna for hosting. I'm really stoked that MAPS was really excited to collaborate on this. And also just want to hold that, you know, there's 1.4 billion Muslims, which means that we've got like 1.4 billion different experiences. And, you know, just want to start by saying that, like, I'll speak for myself and through my own experience, but don't want this to be like me speaking on behalf of Islam or on behalf of all Muslims. There's a huge variety and huge variation in perspectives and belief systems and care and approaches, and there's also a lot of kind of trauma and fear and association with institutionalized religion in general and Islam in particular for some people. So I just want to hold that, and hopefully we can hold that gently as we have this conversation. But that said, let's get into the question. So thank you for bearing with me with that. So yeah, wow, what does it mean to identify as Muslim? So we were raised Muslim. Our father was born in Delhi, in Old Delhi, and raised in Karachi, and came to the United States in the 80s, where he met our mother, who was born in Cali, Colombia, who was raised Catholic. So we're part of like a really complex and beautiful multi-religious, multicultural community growing up. So we had a lot of contact with a lot of different religious stories and religious approaches and spiritual practice. And that really kind of formed my own understanding of like what it meant to be practicing something, you know, a practice of some kind of religion or a faith or whatever that was. So I was also 11 when 9/11 happened. I was in 6th grade. And as a person who was born in California, you know, my parents are from other places, or our parents are from other places, but I was born here. We were all born in Fresno, California, in the Central Valley. You know, I was raised going to Sunday school and teaching and learning Arabic and reading the Quran. And I taught Islamic studies starting from about the age of 12. I was teaching younger kids, and I'm trying to understand it and grapple with it myself. After 9/11 happened, I kind of doubled down on that and was like, whoa, like there's this perception of Muslims that's out in the world. You know, people, I've said before, like I feel like I was politically socialized without my consent. Suddenly my identity was like in everyone's radar and I had to justify it and explain it. And at that point, you know, our mother had converted from Catholicism to Islam, but years after my parents got married, it was something that my dad was really spacious about, our father was really spacious about. So I feel very grateful that while my dad and my mother, after as a convert, were both very active in asking us to keep the tenets of the faith. You know, there's that kind of classic trope of converts being extra hardcore about it. I definitely felt that from my mom, and whose name is Monica, and who passed 10 years ago this year, actually. So just also honoring her spirit and the way that she showed us so many ways. But yeah, so for a long time it was like, I'm Muslim because like everyone else doesn't want me to be. And for a long time there was like, even though I had a lot of doubts and still have a lot of critique and concerns about the way the faith is articulated and the way that it's practiced in the world, I stayed with that identity because it was a political thing for me. I was like, I need to say I'm Muslim because if I don't, then who will? And so that was me throughout like really my teenage years. It was around the same time that I came into contact with psychedelics. We'll talk more about that later, I think. But for me, it just meant like, what does it mean to surrender, to submit to the will of the way, so like in this path of peace, which is what Islam means for those that don't know. Islam is the way of peace, and like that was always the way that it came back to. So for me, Muslim was like, okay, being in alignment with the way of peace, which for a while was a political choice, and then over the years, we'll get more into it, I think, has been a lot more about kind of the actual spiritual mythology and the story and the narrative that, you know, I kind of see myself in what is ultimately, I think, a very pantheistic experience for me. But I'll pause there for now. I'm curious what Isak has to say.
No, thank you for that. And thank you for providing a lot of that context on our family. And I think it's really important to kind of mention that because I think our upbringing is a very unique situation compared to a lot of other folks and a lot of other experiences out there. Interestingly enough, I think I would have to say I definitely agree with Izzy on the sort of political identity of what Islam was to me growing up. But I think in a very different way, especially being younger. I was 6 when 9/11 happened. I took a little bit of a different approach in seeing that it was being an othered sort of identity. And it was something that I actually felt a level of sort of fear or discomfort about being attached to it. I mean, when you go to high school in a predominantly non-Muslim place, you get called things like terrorist as a joke, and you get called many different things that make you feel like you have to like sort of protect yourself. So it was something that it was difficult for me to sort of be out and loud about in my earlier years, despite the fact that we went to Muslim camp for 18 years every summer. We went to Sunday school for 18 years every Sunday. And so for me, something that was always very important to grapple with because of this idea that it could have been a threat to me as well. I mean, things that I observed was Izzy being verbally harassed by someone when he was in, I think, 8th grade for wearing a shirt that said Muslim. And that to me was an indication enough that I can't be out and loud and proud about it, especially as someone who was, I don't know, at the time, probably like 9 or 10. I was very young. So it was one of those things that like, I'm trying to grapple with what my identity is, but I'm being told the identity that I'm growing up in is wrong or is being challenged by the status quo. And that's something that's very difficult to deal with. But what Islam really meant to me and the way that we grew up in the household that we did was that Islam was really just a sort of spiritual blueprint that was passed down by our father's generation. So it almost felt like something that we had to inherit, whether it was a choice or not. What we came to learn later on down the line was that we did have a choice, and that it was never something that was really forced upon us. That's something that I do really appreciate about how our dad taught us Islam. That it's one of those things that if you see the beauty in the religion, you will gravitate it towards it naturally. And I think that's kind of what happened throughout the rest of my life. But really the way that I look at Islam for me is that it is a very important cultural identity, and it's a very important community for me. So like after 9/11, for a lot of us, we were very, very active in the Muslim community. Like Izzy said, we grew up in a household that was half Colombian, half Pakistani. Most of my mom's immediate family was here in California. So we grew up in a very Colombian family setting. But when you think about, what is the quote, that it takes a village to raise a kid, that the village that we were raised in was the Muslim community, was the Pakistani community. Like after or before Sunday school, the Saturday night before, we would be going to a potluck at another person from the Muslim community's home. Like people were always opening themselves up. And what that really showed me was that the Muslim community is a community that's there for each other. And we had no choice at the time. But what I was really able to learn from that was that if you really work together and band together as a community, you can really overcome a lot of those challenges. And in the Central Valley, which is a historically conservative place in California, when we grew up to now, is very different how people treat the Muslim community. It's not seen as something that's negative. I mean, all of the sort of Islamic centers and masjids in Fresno have really taken it upon themselves their responsibility to have to educate the masses on this. And overall, I would say it's been pretty successful, but it was still definitely a challenge, and it took decades even. But to kind of wrap everything up, I think to kind of what Izzy's point is, like, at the end of the day, I think what Islam is to me is living your life with intention and mindfulness. And that if you're doing things with the intent for healing and for the benefit of mankind, then you are truly following the sort of blueprint of Islam.
Thank you guys both for such a beautiful answer. I love the way that you're saying it's like a spiritual blueprint, because that totally resonates with me, and you guys couldn't have said it any better. Now, relating this to what you guys do today, how would you say your work aligns with your Islamic identity from what you just explained to me?
Yeah. Wow. I think in some ways ESEX is more on point than mine, but I can share that. You know, I got a chance to write an article about this. For those that haven't seen, it was published in Double Blind. It's in the fifth volume, and it's also online. You can get it on their website. But I touch upon this a little bit if people want to go into more, you'll hear more detail. But I kind of, jumping off of where ESEC ended, I have kind of experienced and internalized my understanding of Islamic practice as one that's in alignment with peace and justice. And those are two big concepts. That's right there is like a lot, you know. And I think when I think peace, I was really interested before I went to law school, before I started formally studying drug policy, in international diplomacy and in peace and conflict studies, and like how we did that. That was kind of an outcome of being in the post 9/11 generation, of seeing like what happens in conflict, and studying war, and studying the military-industrial complex, and studying the role of the United States in the current the contemporary colonial, imperialist, capitalist world that we live in, and just like the way that those all folded into each other. So it was in some ways quite radicalizing. And I used to joke that I'm like the radical Muslim that everyone's really afraid of, but I don't make that joke so much anymore. But I say that to say that like the move toward drug policy for me was a direct output of being part of a number of underground drug using criminalized communities for a lot of my teenage years. I like a lot of other first generation Muslims in the United States, lived a double life for a long time. I was like in school, a really good student, doing all the things that my parents wanted me to do, and also getting in a lot of trouble and like getting involved in situations and scenes that I think in retrospect may have been considered high risk. And as I got older, into my late teens and early 20s, I had more friends who, died by suicide or had mental health breaks or were criminalized or had dealt with undercover officers or controlled deliveries or had their houses raided. Like, it just kept escalating. So the kind of justice of the way the war on drugs is actually practiced was in my face in those years, even though I, like, to the outside, this like star student who was involved in interfaith dialogue post 9/11 doing this. It was like all simultaneous. It was all happening at the same time for me. So the move toward drug policy is really like one way I see of articulating a world that is oriented toward peace and justice. It's not the whole story, but because of my own personal experience with substances and communities that use them, I really saw how it was in some ways like the war zone in the United States. It was like the domestic, and it's true, it's the place where the United States military, like US government, has most militarized its domestic practices. It's around the war on drugs. So that was like a big clarifying for me, where I was like, oh, if I want to work toward peace, then this is one of those ways. And there was a campaign some years ago that I think was done by maybe Support Not Punish or one of the large UN institutions called just Drug Peace. And I was just like, whoa, what is drug peace? Like, because, and the last thing I'll say about this for now is that, like, understanding drug policy isn't just understanding, like, decriminalization and legalization and psychedelic policy and all that cool stuff. It's also understanding, like, large-scale, multi-generational international trade. And as people who also have who grew up there and whose family left there, partially as a result of violence and the tension and economic and kind of insecurity growing up in Colombia in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, like I really saw how the drug war was not just my friends getting arrested or their houses getting raided because they were getting surveilled because of whatever reason. It was also like the fight of the campesinos who are growing the coca and who are also exploited by the cartels. It's like the kids that are being recruited into these systems. It's like the families who are losing people. It's like, it's so much more than just like the drugs that we're consuming as Americans. So that was like a big wake up call. And when that to me was like, oh, this is the call toward justice. And there's a lot of ways to do it. There's a lot of ways to approach that. But like for me, that's what felt the truest and also felt most aligned with like what I understood, what I felt like I could see and comment on. So like my work today, and I can go into more detail, although, there's other places to see that, of doing psychedelic policy reform, is one way I see to like articulate that vision toward peace, even though it's really messy and complex as we go. Yeah.
Cool, thank you for that. And it's really funny because I would say that like I have the sort of same conclusion that Izzy has as to how I ended up in this space, but I think a very different sort of path to get there, even though we grew up in the same household. Like I initially took this area of policy and work from a very academic perspective. While I was in college, my area of research actually was the war on terror. As you can imagine, given everything that I had just talked about, like that was something that always really stuck with me. And so when I started doing my research for my honors thesis while I was in undergrad, I was doing really deep dives into the war on terror and how that is affecting Afghanistan, Iraq, and a lot of these other sort of Muslim countries. And one of the most interesting sort of testimonials that I read while doing that research was someone who had testified in Congress basically saying that the war on terror will not be over until the war on drugs is over. And it's really interesting because the two are very well intertwined despite not really people considering the two being a thing. So for example, when you think about Afghanistan, a lot of opium poppies are grown there. Before the invasion of the United States in 2001, the Taliban had essentially eradicated opium poppies in Afghanistan by the year 2000. They saw it as immoral. They didn't think it was a thing that a Muslim country should be involved in. But when you have a world superpower coming in and bombing your country and destroying any sort of opportunity for economic livelihood, you go back into these sort of underground spaces where you can make money. And so there's a direct correlation between like the increased sort of production of poppies in Afghanistan and the war on terror actions that the US took in those countries. And so through a lot of my research, I talked to veterans, I talked to a lot of folks who really like went into the details of it. And when you really look at some of the more like intimate details of it, you can see that even though the United States has this sort of stance against drugs and trying to eradicate and be the police on drugs, when you look at Afghanistan, it was different. In some cases, they would destroy people's poppies. In other cases, they would protect people's fields of poppies. It always came down to who they were loyal to, who they were working with. So if it benefited the United States, they were more than open to letting people continue to grow these poppies, even though they have this sort of global stance against the war on drugs or against drugs. And so that was something that really stuck out to me. And I was like, okay, if my goal is going to be really trying to understand and end this idea of what the war on terror is, there needs to be that first step, which is the war on drugs, which has a much longer and much deeper history in United States policy. But the way that it really related to the work that I started doing in the cannabis space was that much like the Muslim community having to really band together and become a self-sustaining community, that was something that I really observed in the cannabis community as it was starting to emerge here in California. So there was a lot of people, legacy operators, social equity operators, people who've been operating in the cannabis space for decades and decades. The reason why it's legal here is because of the work that they had put into it. Yet when you legalize cannabis in a state like California and put into place something like Prop 64, the only way you can operate is if you have a ton of money that you can really lose. And so what I was able to observe in a lot of these sort of legacy communities was that they were building their own self-sustaining economic systems because that was the only way that they could really operate. And that was something that really resonated with me. And so I ended up finding myself at a corporation in the cannabis space, kind of being that big bad side. But what I was able to do, one, I started working on the legal team and really trying to understand the nuance of operating in this space. But I eventually moved into the public affairs team, focusing on social impact and developing programming to actually help support underrepresented founders in the cannabis space. So I think it's really important. Anyone that has this sort of corporate identity or corporate sort of perspective on the cannabis space has a responsibility to help support and build the legacy of what this industry is. And so much like what Izzy said, like it's sort of the principles of like justice and peace and those sorts of ideals that I was able to observe in this space. And I think what's really interesting about the cannabis space and even the psychedelic space is that because it's so brand new, we have the opportunity to make it the most diverse industry we've ever seen. I mean, the last big industry to pop up in most of our lifetimes is tech. And tech is something that is not really seen as the most diverse sort of space. And so when looking at the cannabis industry and the psychedelic space, we have this opportunity to create a more just system as we're building it. And for me, that's something that I do believe is truly a sort of piece of my Islamic identity, is pushing towards that level of justice that most people want to see.
Amazing answers from the both of you. Isak, when you said that the war on terror will not be over until the war on drugs is over, yes. And Izzy is a former SSDP board director, so he knows all about that drug policy, and so do you, Isak. You guys are so experienced in that realm. I do want to take a transition from the industry to more of a personal perspective. And I'm curious to see, how has the substances that you've used in the field that you're in, affiliate with professional and personal risk? Like, have you spoken to your parents about this? How do your elders feel? I know in the Islamic community, we have a lot of these stigmatizations of it, and we're like, oh my gosh, I shouldn't be doing this, and we have this guilt. And I'm curious to see if you guys have experienced that in the professional field and also with your family and your relatives and loved ones.
Yeah, this is, I know I'm supposed to be like tracking, but I can't help but like see the comments that are coming in. It's just so joyful to see all of the engagement. So I just want to appreciate everyone jumping in on that. The first thing I'll say actually before going to the more personal stuff is that like I'm not a scholar. I'm not a religious scholar. So I'll share my perspective on how I've navigated these questions. But ultimately, they're questions that people have to come to answers to themselves. And one of the things I really love about Islam is that while there is a jurisprudence, there is a legal and kind of structure inside of the faith. At its core, it's really just like you and God, Allah, Great Spirit, dear Creator, like just that. And the fact that it's not mediated, I think, it doesn't have to be mediated, feels very powerful. With the Quran, with the Sunnah. But that to me gives a lot of beautiful openness that I didn't really see as a kid, because it's a very classic situation where when people either immigrate voluntarily or are forced to leave as refugees from their country and move to a place like the United States, sometimes there's a calcification or a rigidity that gets infused into the practice because people want to protect it. And I think you see that a lot with diaspora, not just in Islam, but you see that in a lot of cultures where people kind of really try to hold on, like in the face of this like cultural vacuum that is, the United States. So yeah, I was definitely, subject to the whole story that like participating in these activities were bad, that there was something that we had to stay away from. Growing up in Fresno, that wasn't a choice. There was no staying away from drug culture where we grew up. Like my parents tried really hard. Believe me, they tried as hard as they possibly could, especially our mom, who was really afraid. She grew up seeing the worst of the cartels and like very, very up close and personal. So she had a lot of fear, I think, and a lot of maybe trauma from growing up in that way, and was like, whoa, I really want to protect you. And she really tried. Despite her best efforts, like, we came into contact with it. I myself when I was 15. Now over half of my life of just like practicing and understanding and researching. I was one of those kids who read everything about something and then tried to find it and just in that back and forth. So, I hid it for a while. But the first time I was arrested and suspended from school for something drug related, I was 17. I was a senior in high school. And I don't think I've talked very much about the story publicly and won't go into detail today, but, by then, my friends and I were throwing undergrounds and they were getting raided by cops. And, within the next couple of years, like I had friends, like I said earlier, who were getting in all kinds of trouble. So there was no way to like hide it. So it's hard to say you regret something that happened so long ago in the way that it did, but like, it was hard. It was really hard for our family. It was really hard for my mom. And it was challenging to, see them trying so hard to protect us and for us to still be so like, I'm going to go out there and do whatever that is. So in some ways there was no choice. It wasn't like, do I want to do this? Do I want to explain this to them or not? It was more just like, hey, your kid is in custody. Like, you need to come pick him up. It was like that. That was their socialization to me, to me in my contact with this work when I was a younger person. But I will say that, one of the things our parents always told us was like, they were really, I feel very grateful. Our dad is a very devout, but not dogmatic Muslim. He's been very, very spacious. He introduced me to Taoism actually when I was a teenager, and was always really spacious about how he experienced it. He, youngest person, came to the United States from Pakistan, had no contact, and then married a Colombian woman. Like, whoa, like what a shift from like hundreds of years of our history there. Like what's going on? So in some ways, like I models to try something different and to be a little bit outside of what felt like what it was supposed to be, even though there was also kind of this tension that I'm describing. But I will say that one of the things that our dad was always really was like, whatever we do to study it and to understand it really well and to learn as much as can be learned about something before like saying something or doing something. That was a big value that we had. So I think the fact that, at least for me, when I went to law school, and I went to law school 10 years ago thinking that I was going to be focusing on surveillance. Actually, that's like the other issue kind of related to what Isak was saying with respect to the war on terror and so on. I was really, really radicalized by the Patriot Act. And, Muslims knew well before that it wasn't just Muslims that were getting surveilled. We're like, if they have the technology, they're surveilling everybody. And that, 2011, that information came out about the big NSA program. 2014, a couple years later, I was working at an organization called Muslim Advocates in my first summer after law school, after my first year of law school. That was when the news broke that, in fact, the NSA is using this technology to spy on basically everybody. And now we're almost 10 years later, and we're still dealing with the repercussions of the DEA buying kind of corporate data to track people because they don't want to go through warrants. You have all of these examples of the FISA court and these kind of shadow courts that get warrants for people or get people's information. Like, that is still happening. That is ongoing right now. And it has been now for probably longer than just the last 10 years. So all of that to say that, like, by the time I was like, oh, this is something to really focus on professionally and in my life, I think our family started to really understand a little bit more like what was going on. And now I feel like a little bit through the woods with that because like Isak and I are both, have engaged in this work professionally now for some time and are really trying to bring like really values and integrity to something that's like definitely already happening. And at this moment, I actually want to give a shout out. So Isak and I are the oldest and youngest. But we have one brother in between, Ibrahim, who maybe he's watching, maybe he's not. But I just want to give him a shout out because it was really the three of us in this conversation. He doesn't work in drug policy, although I've been trying to coax him into it for a long time. But all that to say that, like, the dynamic of explaining it first was like, I don't have a choice. This is what's happening. I'm in trouble here. Can you help me? And then over time, I was like, it's not cool that I was treated that way. It's not cool that my friends were treated that way. So moving toward drug policy professionally, in some ways, felt like a natural extension of all of that, and I think has helped certainly my father and my mother's family, after she passed, to really see how what we're doing has this like larger arc, kind of is tied into all these big values that we're talking about. It's not just like empty hedonism. Not that empty hedonism is also always a bad thing, but maybe that's for the next IG Live or something. But yeah, so that's one piece is like, this is what's happening. I try to be honest about it. I try to be clear about what it is that I care about and why I'm doing this. And I have seen things start to change, in older generations as like the older folks are like, older in age and they're like, wait a minute, what is microdosing thing? Or realizing that cannabis has a lot of benefits for people who are later in age. And maybe I'll let Isak talk more about that. But that it's been an evolution, a very slow evolution, and it hasn't been easy. And I think that there's still a lot of stigma that I try to best navigate by saying like, hey, what are your questions? Let's talk about literally anything. Let's go there,
It's really funny because growing up the youngest in this household, you get the youngest kid privileges, which means that a lot of times you are viewed a little bit more in a relaxed context compared to how Izzy was. I got to, in many cases, see what not to do in order to not get caught or not get in trouble. But also just seeing how Izzy's path led him to where he was showed that it wasn't necessarily wrong what he was doing. It wasn't a bad thing. What he ended up getting into was something that was moving towards justice. And so for me, I didn't really see too much of a risk going into it because I had someone in my own family who was paving that path for me. And it was really funny because it actually was my dad one time who had to sit me down and kind of explain to me that I have a much higher risk tolerance than most people. I've only worked in startups in the cannabis space. And for me, I'm like, yeah, this sounds like fun. But for a lot of people, that's something that's extremely risky, let alone not even the cannabis side, just working in startup spaces is extremely risky. And so I would say my risk tolerance is much higher than I think the average person, partially again because of just seeing the way that my own brother was able to make a professional career out of it. And it's funny because like the first sort of conversation I would say that I had with my dad about this was when I was already working for a company and they were flying me out for meetings out in Wisconsin. And so I had to explain to my dad, hey, like, I know it's finals week in college, but like, I'm invited to go out to these meetings out in Wisconsin. By the way, it's for a corporate cannabis company. And you'd have these moments where he's like, hold on, wait, what are you doing? But at the end of the day, what was really important to someone like our dad was he used to always say, I don't care what you do, just be the best at it. And when you're coming from an immigrant household, yeah, working in the cannabis space is going to sound very challenging because your initial sort of inclination is this idea that it's just drug dealing in the corner. But when you can see the sort of suit and tie corporate side of it, which has its own issues, for many immigrant parents, they see that as the legitimization of that industry. And so that was something that I think helped make it a little bit easier in the conversations with our family. But like in a grander scheme of things, like it is an extremely stigmatized space, and there's going to be haters no matter what. And I see this as an opportunity to educate folks. And so like, it's really funny because a lot of times when I would go to the Islamic Center or something when I'm visiting home, a lot of people will ask, so what do you do? Like, I mean, when you grow up in this community, you disappear for a little bit and then you come back, everyone's like, what do you do? What do you do? I'm not gonna lie, it's still difficult and awkward to have those conversations. And it's really what's even funnier is that when I do talk about it, because I'm not ashamed about it, there's still an awkwardness, but I'm willing to have that conversation. What I think is hilarious is that often people love to go to my dad and be like, do you know what your kid is doing? Like, do you realize what he's doing? And I think one of the things that's really helped reduce this sort of feeling of risk is that our family really understands what we're doing and is accepting of what we're doing. And like our dad, who has always been this sort of barometer for what a good Muslim is going to look like, has always considered the work that we do contextualized within being a good Muslim. And so there's the ability to kind of reduce that level of stress. And what I think is also really interesting about this space in particular is that like for most of the people that I know in this space, Muslim or not, when they enter the cannabis and psychedelic space, it's not because they're just trying to get people high. There's so much more to it. And that's the part that often gets forgotten. And so when I go back to saying like this is an opportunity to educate, it is challenging to have to sort of fight a lot of these stigmas. But we really do have, one, the responsibility, but two, the opportunity to really change people's perspective on this. And I think that is really, really important. And so like from a professional like perspective, like I always saw this as a way to carve my own path in what we're doing, which I do feel like a level of security in. But then personally, I do understand that it opens me up to scrutiny. And honestly, I'm okay with that, because in order to have this conversation, people need to be willing to be scrutinized and have that conversation. And so like, I would say like, just to kind of, to kind of wrap this up is like, I guess I came out as Muslim in the cannabis industry, similar to how Izzy wrote an article for Double Blind. I wrote an article kind of talking about cannabis and Islam and just really sort of posing the question whether or not cannabis is halal or haram. And I wasn't really trying to pull a conclusion out of it. What I was trying to essentially say is that when these principles exist and they align with Islam, can it really be wrong? And kind of just presenting that to people. And so I'm always open to hearing what people have to say. I can share the article later on. But I'll stop there. Yeah.
Can I say a couple more things? Just to add on to this, because I'm also watching the chat and like wanting to respond to some of these pieces. So first off, just as one point, really wanting to acknowledge that it's hard to create that dichotomy. Oh, I'm in a suit and tie in a corporate environment, so I'm not the same as those other people. Those other people who we were, buying drugs from for years, like. So I do want to acknowledge that stigma and how like there's a double-edged sword to like the visibility of like, oh yeah, it's legitimized in this way, but doing that by continuing to stigmatize or throw other people under the bus it's an edge. And I think that's part of why not just participating in like increasing an industry, but really like fighting the war, like against the war on drugs and designing a compassionate, healthy post-prohibition environment requires us to bring all of those people into this conversation. And I think that's where I feel like the next edge is. Like we've gotten some of the corporate legitimacy that some people are really fighting for. That's going to happen, but like we can't leave people behind. And I really appreciate you, Psych, the way that you're framing that, because like we do have to kind of hold both the reality of how people hold that in how we describe it, but also don't want to compromise those values. Mm-hmm. And I want to speak to, this idea of family support. Like, I want to be really clear. Like, I did not have family support for a long time. Like, I had to really, really like fight to convince. And I tried using logic for the longest time. I got a medical marijuana card when I was 19 years old. And I was like, see, anxiety and insomnia, like this is legit. A doctor said it's legit. And my parents were like, okay, that is not persuasive to us whatsoever. Like that doesn't count. So it's interesting because one of the things that I've learned, and you touched on this really well, is that like, it depends. There's a few different angles. If you're talking about synthetic drugs, then like it's really helpful to talk about the mental health angle. And I know that there's a lot of valid critique about like the focus on medicalization and the medical angle and like the focus on DSM based diagnosis. Like those are valid critiques. Our healthcare industry, our healthcare system is I was going to say whack, but like that's like too simple of a word, like the complexity of how problematic it is. But it is absolutely true that looking through the lens of medical treatment does make a difference for people. And it is true that a lot of people see that as like a more legitimate understanding because that line between drug and medicine can be so thin. The other thing that I think is really important is a couple people in the chat have mentioned this, and I really love it. It's a really good point, is that when you're not talking about synthetics, we're talking about plants.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it really helps to remember that we were all on this hype machine because of it's because of prohibition that we've made such a big deal out of mushrooms that grow out of the ground. That's why we're making such a big deal of a plant that grows all over the ancestral homeland of literally 2 billion people in Central and South Asia. So I do like to remind people that like the idea that this prohibition is inherent to our culture is simply not true. A lot of people don't want to hear that, and a lot of parents are not ready to hear that. So I'm not saying you should be like, I'm just reclaiming a 4,000-year-old practice, like even if that's true. But it is helpful to really ground it in reality, into the plant aspect. Like it really does help to know. And I know, again, there's valid critique of the like, oh, psychedelics have been used for thousands of years, or cannabis has been used for this or that. Like, yeah, let's get specific about what we mean when we say that. And also, like, a lot of that is true in one way or another. And there's something to be said for the fact that if you try to, and it's hard, it's maybe impossible for some people to do in their lifetime, but if you try to like undo the colonial conditioning that our lenses are inherently pushed through as people who are living in the West. And I'm speaking, of course, for people who are in that environment. This is not true for everybody in every circumstance, for sure. But that like idea that like we should feel shame or that there's some sort of moral harm for being in a relationship to a plant that comes from the earth, like that is there's something really off about that. And I think that, like, again, that's not going to be persuasive to everybody, but that can be a really grounding force. And I think that, it's really important. I think of it, I've used the term instead of like code switching, like cosmology switching. Like different people come from different cosmologies and different perspectives. Like, are they persuaded by the Western healthcare paradigm? Are they persuaded by some sort of traditional spiritual paradigm? And then one last thing, sorry, I know this is a long answer and we only have a little time left, but the other thing I think is about the actual, detail of like prohibition. In Islam, and Isak and I have both written and talked about this, like there's a verse 443 that specifically talks about intoxication. And there's a lot of perspectives and variations on how that actually gets interpreted. And that's why I started by saying, like, I'm not a scholar. I'm not like out here saying that this is the interpretation. But when I think about my personal experience and what I've seen with plant medicines, with psychedelics, with other drugs even, I'm really thinking, like, what is an intoxicant and what does it mean to be intoxicated? My dad still to this day will be like, he knows all the things, I'm now way more open about him, all the things that I've done and all this. And he still says, like, please don't drink alcohol because that's so clear. That's one of those things. And I understand where he's coming from, but I think the idea that prohibition inherently extends to all substances, all plants, all medicine, it's a little bit of a thinner line. And I think that's where, going way back to what Isak said at the beginning, that's where this intention factor really comes in. Like, what is the actual thing? That is something only you can know. Only I can know why I'm doing something or what something is doing for me. So that, I mean, obviously, once you hit a threshold, then other people can tell. But there's a certain level where understanding how it shows up for you and how that honestly in your own self like brings you closer or further away from something in spirit is a really important litmus test. And again, like, not everyone would agree with that. I think there's valid disagreements and critiques of that perspective. But I just want to say that that's how I've navigated that myself, to be like, what are the other ways to talk about this besides this is a criminalized thing that I could get in trouble for? I understand why other parents don't want their kids to do it. They don't want their kids to be criminalized. It's a protection mechanism. It's a valid protection mechanism. But it's good to see what are the other stories there.
A funny quote that you just made me think of is like, the most dangerous thing about cannabis is getting caught.
Totally. I mean, Yeah. I mean, prohibition has made all of it worse. I mean, that I think we can all agree on.
And I mean, on top of that, like profiling is still so prominent in
Hmm.
America and just in general. And being Muslim and then having drugs, double whammy. Like it's just even worse. And so my heart is so warm for you guys that your parents are now very understanding of your substance use and your experience. And I would love to grow more upon the topic of doing psychedelics with your parents. If we have time for that, I want to fit in one more question and then we can move into Q&A. So if you guys have something small to add about that, that'd be amazing.
Well, I think that because I want to be quick, what I'll speak to is more about intergenerational work, like more zoomed out as opposed to anything specific for this conversation. And what I'll just say is I think that as people start to see, one of the big moments for when I was talking to my dad about ayahuasca some years ago was like, he would ask me like, what is it and how it's made? And I was like, well, it's plants that are boiled. And he was like, wait, what? I was like, yeah, it's plants that are boiled, and and put over heat. And he was just like, oh, my mom used to do that with ginger all the time. And I was like, yeah, like it's helpful. Conversations that can be like one of the ways that kind of helpful to start. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that
But let's
full
go to the
answer.
Q&A. I'm curious about what
Yeah,
people
let's
who
hear
have been
it.
asking.
I mean, as you clarified earlier, we are not scholars in any way, but a lot of the things that you mentioned go down to intention. And one of the questions that I saw, and it's Ramadan, is can we microdose or do psychedelics during Ramadan? And ultimately for me, I believe it's up to intention. But what are your take on this? I mean, we're
Oof.
not scholars, so
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to say that every single time. And actually, I do want to say one more thing really quickly before I get into that answer, which is related to the past question around identity and profiling. I think that people underestimate the number of Black Muslims that there are in the United States and around the world. And I just want to recognize that, like, when you have both, like, a racial identity that's profiled and also a cultural and religious identity that's profiled, that there's even more of that. And I think a lot of people don't know how many Black Muslims there are in the United States, which includes, like, includes people who are unjustly incarcerated and part of that. So I just want to name that because there is a racial element that's not always as clear for people like us who are like ambiguously brown and like have like these like kind of first generation privileges that exist that some other people here don't. So I just want to like recognize that there's a whole shade of that conversation. I did not intentionally use the word shade there, but there's a whole angle of that conversation that we're not, I'm not qualified to talk about that I see, and that's part of the war on drugs story. That's also beyond the war on drugs story, but I just want to presence that before we go into the other questions. So okay, so yeah, I mean, who knows the answer to this question? I'll say that. I'll say that for myself. I actually, there was a long period of time from probably the age of like 16 or 17 till my early 20s that I was really, really like, Muslim in name only. I did it because I was like, this is a political identity, but like, I don't really like the fact that there's like this stigmatization of queerness in Islam. I don't like the fact that there's this patriarchy. Of course, over time, I've really teased apart like what's really part of the faith and the belief system, what's part of like the patriarchal political articulation of it in the contemporary world, which is a whole other conversation. But as as a young person, I was like, I don't know about this whole thing. Like, and I still have a lot of skepticism. And I like to say I practice Islamowaska because I'm like, Islam is like part of it, but there's other things that are going on. So for me, I actually kept fasting for Ramadan during that time. It was really like the only practice that I really kept during that time. And I kept fasting because I had a lot of friends who were dealing with already at a young age substance use disorders, alcoholism, overdoses, and other kind of issues related to that, problematic use. And I utilized Ramadan as a way to practice discipline, even in the midst of my experimentation. I was like, I'm going to try all this stuff. I'm going to experiment, do this and that, but I'm going to keep this practice because it's good for me. So now, 18, 19, holy wow, I think 20 years after the first time I fasted, I've been fasting for about 20 years now. For Ramadan, that was one of the things that never was broken. I actually take this month as an opportunity for me, who is consuming and engaging with these substances in relation to these substances in my day-to-day, I actually take this time as a time away. I don't think everyone has to do that. But I learned the really hard way that like you can't really get super messed up and then fast the next day. It's like it's not possible. It's really hard for your body. So I just say that to say that like, everyone has to make this choice themselves. Microdosing, is it a supplement? Is it a drug? Is it a medicine? Like, what's your experience of it? How are you using it? So I take a break from like smoking anything. I actually also take a break from caffeine during Ramadan, but that's a little bit sadistic. Not everyone has to do that. I just say that to say that like I take this opportunity to like really practice the discipline that I have in my day to day, but that I don't always like enforce so actively with myself. So different people are going to learn differently, but like I'm not going to tell you what you can do, or someone what they can do. That's just how I interpreted it. And it's nice because it's like every year I get a chance to like detox and reset and like let that like purifying internal fire kind of really clear out what's going on. Yeah.
And I don't have like too much to add, but again, like what Izzy said, like it really comes down to your intention and what you're doing this for. For some people, like they do need to take this time or want to take this time to cleanse themselves of caffeine or whatever things that they feel that they use as a crutch, and that's okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Other people want to use it as an opportunity and a time and a month to find other ways of spiritual growth. And if microdosing is something that you do with the intention of building up that sort of spiritual power in you, then I don't think it's necessarily wrong. But again, it's really going to come down to the individual. Like, I don't want to say that like you can do this and you can't do this. It really comes down to your choice. And I think that's the biggest thing, that one of the things that we talked about when it comes to fasting in the first place, like it is our choice to fast. And so it's really an important opportunity for us to practice our willpower and practice our ability to decide how we want to sort of step into this month.
It was bold to choose to do this during Jummah in the middle of Ramadan. I'm like experiencing the headache right now, and I'm like, oh, I'm getting a little bit woozy. Like I forgot in the middle of the so I was like, all right. Anyway.
Yeah. So I've got my notes right behind.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was trying to keep a time that wasn't like on Jummah, like time.
It's all good.
I thought it was ironic that we did it on Jummah, which is beautiful. I mean, Ramadan is a mental and physical discipline. And I totally agree with what you guys said. I want to plant this question as a seed. It might be mostly for you because you're one of the co-founders of Halal Hemp. Is there a plan on how to get Islamic scholars involved and how? And I think this is a beautiful question because how do we expand on this after this Instagram Live? How can we find out if this is really allowed? Get those answers from real Islamic scholars and maybe get them out of their shell and help us have this conversation. So, Islak, if you want to answer that.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you asked that question because I saw people were touching on it in the comments. But first and foremost, it's already happened. It's already begun. There are scholars out there who have done the research and really done a deep dive into the history of cannabis, Islam, and kind of how those interact, both from just a regional perspective and a religious perspective, because cannabis has been around in ancient Persia, in Morocco, in Turkey, and all of these places predating Islam. And so like, I think it's really important, as he said, to be able to separate the religion and the culture as two separate things, but they do intertwine. And this is one of those places where it actually does intertwine in the history and in the text. And so one of the reasons why we were able to even start Halal Hemp in the first place was my business partner, Jamita, had been doing a lot of deep research into this, and she's been a huge advocate against the war on drugs and criminalization of cannabis in Malaysia, and want to make sure to give her a huge shout out because she is really fighting the good fight and really trying to help destigmatize this in the actual region. It's easy for us to talk about this from the US, but when we're really trying to push in actual Muslim countries, places that have the clout to be able to talk about it, it is its own challenge in itself. But the way that you do that is by, as what you had mentioned, what do the scholars say? And what does the actual sort of religious infrastructure that exists say about it? And so what really led Jamita to be able to come up with the idea of Halal Hemp and how we could really justify it was that in 2018, there was actually a fatwa that was written by a scholar named Sheikh Mustafa from the Islamic Center of Orange County, who basically was tasked by the North American Fiqh Council, which is a sort of religious organization that legitimizes fatwas, to look into the legitimacy of medical cannabis in its context in Islam. And we actually have videos of this on our website. So if you go to halalhemp.org, you can find it. But we had this event a couple of years ago where we had him kind of explain his sort of thought process and how he went into researching this topic. And it was really funny because he told us that when he was first tasked with this and he started doing the research, he already had a preconceived notion that he believed that people were only smoking weed to get high. And so he already had this sort of idea that wasn't the conclusion that we ended up with. But like any proper scholar, they're going to do the research and they're going to change their opinion based on the research that they found. And so he went into a very deep dive into the text, both religious and historical regional texts about the plant, and was able to see that like 500-600+ years ago in Islamic texts, you can find references to medical cannabis. And beyond that, when you look at not just the text, when you look at some of the schools of thought in Islam, you can find different schools of thought from opposite sides of the spectrum come to the same conclusion. So some of the research that he talked about was that the Hanafi school of thought basically says that Muslims are allowed to consume reasonable amounts of cannabis for medical purposes. And similarly, on the other side, when you have a more liberal school, but there was an imam at the school of Nawawi that argued that it is not prohibited to consume small quantities of hashish for medical purposes and in some contexts for some people in religious practice. So in Sufism, for example, there is a history of using hashish to practice reaching God and becoming closer to God. And so not only do you take the medical perspective, which is how really the North American Fiqh Council and a lot of the students will take it, as that it is medicine. I mean, if you think about any of the other sort of pharmaceuticals that are prescribed to Muslims every day, how many of them can you say are non-psychoactive, that really follow all of these very precise sorts of things that make it halal versus a plant that, as our dad would say, a plant that God created. and so when you really look at it, there's the medical sort of context to it, but you can also find the sort of religious practice in it as well. So there is a mix on both sides that not only is it medicine for you to help your sort of physically ailing body, but you can also use it as a spiritual medicine to help bring you closer to God. My suspicion and understanding is that the whirling dervishes in Sufism smoke a little bit of hashish before they whirl because it's able to help them sort of bring them into this transient state that allows them to feel like they can reach God at a much closer level. And like, even though traditionally people see the sort of 5 daily prayers as that sort of physical practice with God, you can see it in other ways with Sufism and the dervishes and how they practice. And so there's two sides to it. One, like from the medical perspective, I'm very confidently saying that there is sort of precedent and there is text to show that it is a legitimate thing. And that's why we chose to name our organization, our company, Halal Hemp, because we want to go from the offset saying that this is halal, this is permissible for you. But then going beyond into it, you can talk about how it can actually help your spiritual practice. And then even further into it, you can look into the social justice elements and how it's really helping with the community and all of that. And so kind of taking those three perspectives, I think there is like legitimate arguments to be made that this actually does not, in fact, conflict with our religion.
Amazing answer. I'm so glad that we're talking about this because it's going to plant the seed for future conversations for us to build upon it and start making this conversation visible for others to feel more comfortable about their spiritual psychedelic use, because a lot of people still experience that guilt no matter what we say, and that's okay. We are going to have to wrap things up, but I am so grateful for having the both of you two here. You guys are such mindful individuals, and I've learned so much, and I'm sure everybody else did. And I'm overwhelmed with their support. If you guys have any other questions, I would love to connect. My email is henna@shakrina.net. And I'm hoping we can build a community of Muslims and psychedelics. So thank you both so much for joining me, and thank you to everybody.
Thank you.
Can
for
I say
hosting us.
can
Yeah,
I say one closing point? If that's
absolutely.
okay, just for those that are still on. I just noticed this comment and I really appreciated it. Someone mentioned just the gendered aspect, and I just want to acknowledge that we're two men or male-bodied people, and that there's a very big dynamic and factor with respect to that, both because of the visibility of the hijab and also like the cultural aspects of being a woman in Islam. So I do want to acknowledge the limitations of our perspective. And obviously, like, we can't talk about everything in an hour. There are a lot of things that we just kind of like, opened up a trailhead, but didn't really go down. So I just want to like hold that and recognize that there's a lot of, that there are, and I hope to see a lot of other perspectives come through. I'll just vulnerably at the end here say I was a little bit worried about coming on because, like, for those that know, I do a lot of talks about psychedelics. I'm quite visible. Like, I was really worried about this conversation and like, is it okay to take it more in this level? And now I've been encouraged by people who feel less safe to be visible to like start somewhere so that people can build. And I really encourage people to build that and to build community where they can have that safety, because not everyone has it. We've described a lot of privilege over the course of this last hour. There are like lots of blessings and care that we have had access to that isn't available to everybody. So again, like trying to hold that reality. And then one other quick thing, sorry, at the end, I just want to respond to one other thing that I saw in the comment around like recreational versus spiritual use, and you talked about this as well, Hannah, and that's its own whole conversation. But I would just urge people to really interrogate like what they mean or what they think of when they think of recreational or getting high or spiritual practice or medical use, and really recognize that there's a lot of variation in the intention and the outcome, and that it's worth actually thinking about like what words we're taught to use about different kinds of behaviors and why those words are being used, and why a word like recreation is so stigmatized. And maybe I'll end with that. Thank you so much, Hannah, for hosting and for this wonderful moderation. Thank you, Isak, for joining. This is the first time Isak and I have ever done a public talk together, so we're super excited.
Very exciting.
Shout out to Ibrahim, the scientist in our family, who's in the middle. He's out here. Oh, yeah, this is great. We can just do a little high five. And yeah, just Ramadan Mubarak, Jummah Mubarak. I hope everyone has a really beautiful rest of your day. Thank you so much for everything.
All right, everybody. Assalamu alaikum.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.